Welcome to the ICAPGen video presenting analysis and correlation in a Level 1 report. I'm Lisa Stokes, an accredited genealogist professional, and I accredited with ICAPGen in the Mid-South region of the United States. The purpose of this video is to teach techniques and skills for writing a genealogy research report. We will cover presenting analysis and correlation of evidence in order to convey solid conclusions in research reports and in a Level 1 fourth-generation project. The specific Level 1 requirements that are covered in this presentation can be found in the Guide to Applying for an Accredited Genealogist Credential, which can be found at ICAPGen.org. To view some of the full version examples that are presented in this video in context, use the links that appear with the description of the video on the ICAPGen YouTube channel. Also, as the examples are presented, be sure to pause the video if you'd like to read them in detail. Also, note that the citations have been removed from many of the examples for visual simplicity. Remember to always cite your sources. An overview of proofwriting is covered in the ICAPGen video entitled Model for a Well-Written Proof. This model was designed to help writers understand the proofwriting concept. So now we're going to cover ideas and details about presenting the sources with analysis and correlation. The first step in the analysis process is to state the reasons a source was searched and what information was expected to be found in that source. Here's the Level 1 requirement in regards to stating rationale for a search. Reasons are given in the written report and log that explain the purpose of searching records or explain what valuable information the researcher expected to find in the records. Stating the reason why a source was searched and what was expected to be found conveys to the reader or to the client how the source supports the research objective. It also justifies why time was spent searching that record type. Here's an example of stating the purpose of a search. Research began by locating Maria del Rosario's civil birth record to learn more about her father, Luis Flores, and to find out what her mother's maiden name was. It was anticipated the record could mention Luis's birthplace and age at the time of Maria del Rosario's birth. Another requirement is that research strategies are employed that reflect laws, customs, historical background, jurisdiction, and record access typical for the accreditation region. These items are explained in the report. Next, let's cover how to present the sources and their information in a clear and organized manner using logic and simplicity. The Level 1 requirement in regard to presenting research findings is the research findings are presented clearly and in a logical order. Additionally, the report clearly explains the significance of key findings provided in the documents. Use narrative to present each source. Additionally, if needed, use one or more of the following to correlate, organize, and present the sources and the information: bullet lists, timelines, charts, maps, tables, abstracts and extracts, transcriptions, etc. Use the technique or the techniques that will best present the specific sources and their information. This first example uses bullet points to clearly present material in an understandable way. This example covers the birth of Lucretia Lewis. After giving an overview, the writer uses a bullet point list to present the sources, information, and evidence. The writer ends the proof with a strong concluding statement. This next example is a section of a proof about the identity of Thomas Beverly Royston. The writer first gives a rationale as to why the land records were searched, and then gives a simple overview of the land grant process. Bullet points are used to summarize the information found in the case file in a clear and concise manner. Tables and charts can be very helpful to correlate and analyze the evidence. A writer can use tables to present information and sources quickly and efficiently, And tables can be especially helpful to convey large amounts of information in a concise format. Make sure the information is presented in a useful, simple, and clear manner. In this example, the researcher summarized the vital information for the children of Robert Mansfield and Martha Duck, so that the reader can quickly see the structure of this family and their vital event dates. Notice that the writer refers the reader to the family group sheet and the research log for citation information in this example. In this example, the writer uses a table to summarize the census records found for the Schultz family. This slide shows the introduction for the table, which gives the background information. Notice that the writer directs the reader to Table 2. Here's Table 2 for the Schultz family. Each family member is listed and then correlated with census information from the 1900 through the 1940 census records. This helps the reader quickly understand the structure of the family. Notice that in this example, the writer adds the footnote citations directly to the table. Here's an example of using a map to help present sources. The writer states that Samuel Combest was not found in census records, but was found on tax records in Pulaski County, Kentucky. The land that Samuel was taxed on is located on Fishing and Pointer Creeks. The writer then directs the reader to the illustration number 1, which we'll look at on the next slide. Here's the reference map labeled as Illustration 1, showing the close proximity of Fishing Creek and Pointer Creek to each other, with red lines in the upper left. There's a red circle drawn around the town of Somerset to show it in relation to the two creeks. Here's an example of using a timeline. This is the introduction to the timeline for the Bramblett family of Forsyth County, Georgia, which outlines the residence of the family members in 10-year increments. This timeline allows the writer to correlate land records and census records for the Bramblett family in 10-year increments. It clearly and succinctly correlates all the sources together to show their residence in Forsyth County, Georgia, and nearby Glimmer County, Georgia over the years. Here's the second half of Table 4.4. If you'd like to read it in more detail, please pause the video. This example comes from a proof about the children of Samuel Combest and Sarah Dick. Bullet points are used to present the extracts or exact quotes from the will of Samuel Combest. Be sure to state whether you're presenting an extract, abstract, or a transcription. Here's an example of including a transcription in the report. This example begins with a subtitle that states that it is a transcription of the Schultz grave markers. And then it explains how the writer obtained the cemetery transcriptions. Notice how the transcriptions themselves are indented on the page and formatted as they were engraved on the markers. Also note that the brackets around Schultz in the transcription. Brackets are used by the writer to indicate that they're adding information. In the case of these grave markers, the brackets indicate that the last name of Schultz was likely written elsewhere on the marker. Use an abstract of key documents when a transcription is too lengthy to include in the report. This example shows one layer of evidence from a proof that helps establish the identity of the children of Robert and Fanny Flatford. The guardianship settlement was a very lengthy document, so this abstract was used to present the information and the evidence found in this source. Notice that the abstract also includes exact quotes or extracts from the original document. Watch the ICAPGen video entitled Extraction, Transcription, and Abstraction to learn more specific details and techniques. Here are some additional tips for presenting sources. First, give clarifying explanations to the reader. Also, direct the reader to another section of the report for details about a related topic or coverage of a subject. And refer the reader to a table, the research log, and/or the family group sheets for more information about a subject or details about a search. The next 4 slides give examples of these above tips. In this example, a clarifying statement was added to the beginning of the generation to let the reader know that the two Robert Mansfields will be differentiated by stating their birth years. The beginning of the narrative is included here to show specifically how the writer added the birth dates for each Robert in parentheses after their names. Another way to differentiate people of the same name is to list the spouse behind the name in parentheses. Here's an example about the religious affiliation of the McElroy and the Gardner families. For analysis about this record, the researcher directs the reader to the 1861 census record, which they have titled Document 3-3, and they state that it can be found in the third generation section of the report. A note directing the reader to another part of the report or project could also be added to a footnote instead of being in the body of the report. In this example, a footnote refers the reader to the third generation research log and family group sheet for details concerning marriage records for Sarah's children. This example covers information about a Bible record for the Samuel Combest family. The writer directs the reader to Table 11, which gives information about the Combest family is found in the Bible record. The reader is also directed to the research log for detailed information about the search for the original Bible record. Next, let's cover the importance of evaluating the reliability of sources and the information found in those sources. Another Level 1 requirement is that, quote, all genealogy terminology was used correctly. So when evaluating the reliability of the sources, the information, and the evidence found, be sure to use proper terminology. So let's go over terminology terms in more depth now. This evidence analysis map was developed by Elizabeth Schoen Mills. It helps genealogists understand the relationship between sources, information, and evidence. A source is the physical form containing helpful information. A source can be a document, a book, an artifact, or a person. A source can be original, derivative, or authored. An original source is the first creation of a source. It's usually considered the most reliable. A derivative source is a subsequent copy of an original source. So an example of that could be an index or an abstract. An authored source is when information and evidence are compiled by an author or a researcher. Locate the most original form of a source as possible. Electronic or digital copies of original documents are generally accepted and treated as good substitutes for original documents. Remember that at least 2 independent sources are required for adequate proof. An independent source is one that was not generated from the same source, such as the same document, the same book, the same artifact, or the same person. For example, if a spouse gave birth information for 2 sources, such as an obituary and a death certificate, these sources are not considered independent because they were created by the same informant. Each source should be cited with a footnote citation to show where it was obtained. Also, when analysis of sources is needed, keep the wording simple and use correct terminology such as original source, derivative source, and authored source. So let's cover some questions that will help in analyzing sources. We need to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. The next several slides will cover some examples of questions that can be asked about sources and their information. Notice how many of the questions intertwine with one another. These questions are to help the applicants understand the types of questions to address when stating the reliability of sources in a Level 1 4-generation report. Remember that not every question needs to be answered for every source, so use your best judgment during the analysis. So first, who created the record? Was it an official county clerk who was responsible for the validity of the record? Was it a family member who had personal knowledge of the information? Did a town, county, state, or federal government create the record? Or did a compiler create an index? When was the record created? Was it created near the time of the event, or was it created years later? And what type of source is the record? Is it an original source or a derivative source, which means a copy of the original, or is it an authored source? How do you know this? Be sure to include details of why the source is original, derivative, or authored, which leads us to the next set of slides. What clues in the record indicate whether it's an original or a copy of an original? Is it a clerk's copy? Is it an abstract? Or is it an index? For example, if a tax record is in alphabetical order, it's probably a tax collector's alphabetized copy of the record because people don't live in alphabetical order. Another example is if original signatures are on the document, it may be a clue that it's an original document. If all the writing and the signatures are in the same handwriting, that may indicate that it's a clerk's copy of an original, leading to the possibility that errors were introduced. Where was the record found and where was the record kept? Was the record found in a county court book in the courthouse? Or was it found in loose papers taken to the County Historical Society and filed there? Was the record found intact in the family Bible that has been in the family for years? Or was it a page torn from the Bible and filed with a Civil War widow's pension? Who kept and preserved the record? Did the county clerk create and keep the record in the county courthouse? And has the record always been kept there? Or was the record moved from place to place for safekeeping during the Civil War, for example? Or in other words, what is the provenance of the record? Provenance is the line of ownership of an heirloom or record to include who owned it, who owns it now, and where it's stored. This is especially important in evaluating the reliability of family records, such as a family Bible or an original marriage certificate that has been passed down through the family. Answer the questions: who created the Bible record, who has the Bible record now, and how did they obtain it? Who passed it to who? This could lend credence to the reliability of the source. The exact provenance of the record can be recorded in the research log and in the citation for this source. Why was the record created, and what was the motivation to create the record? For example, a record may have been created because of a state mandate to record births, or a tax collector was charged with finding all citizens and collecting all applicable taxes. This could indicate that the tax list is reliable because most tax collectors were very thorough in their collection process. Another question is, were there ulterior motives for creating the record? An example of this is a lineage society application where an applicant listed unsourced information with the motivation of obtaining membership to the organization. Also answer the question, why is this record reliable or only moderately reliable or not reliable at all? Be sure to explain this in detail. What other records were likely created that could lead to important information? What are the limits of the source? An example of this is the 1850 through the 1870 U.S. Census enumerations, which don't list a relationship. Therefore, the relationship can only be implied. This is a point that will need to be explained in the report. What is the physical condition of the document? Are there issues with the physical integrity of the document, such as smeared ink, missing or torn pages, illegible penmanship, and so on? Remember that one source is usually insufficient to conclusively prove any event or relationship. So it's very important to ask the question, how does this source and its information correlate with other sources and information found? All of these questions are examples of questions that may be answered in the report to one degree or another. And lastly, what is the rationale for determining one source to be more reliable than another? This is the whole reason that all previous questions were addressed. Within the analysis, give the details of why one source was given more weight than another. This example is the analysis about the reliability of the Stafford County Birth Register. Notice that the correct terminology of original source is used and also derivative source is used. Use the links in the description of this video to view the full example. Okay, looking at the evidence analysis map again, we can see that information is knowledge of dates, names, places, relationships, etc. Information can be primary, secondary, or undetermined. With primary information, the informant has the first-hand knowledge of the event as a witness of the event. For example, information given by a father reporting the birth of his child. With secondary information, the informant has second-hand knowledge of the event and did not witness the event. So an example of that would be a spouse reporting birth information on a death certificate. The spouse did not likely have first-hand knowledge or witness the birth of their spouse, but they have a general knowledge of the birth information for their spouse. When it comes to undetermined information, the researcher is unable to determine whether the information is primary or secondary. For example, the informant on U.S. Census records before 1940 is not stated and is therefore undetermined. So be careful about making definitive statements about who gave the information on the census records. You can theorize that the parents likely gave the information, but the informant may have been a child or an elderly grandparent or a neighbor, making the information less reliable. So be sure to make that clear in your analysis. In the report, analyze the reliability of information and the informant as needed. Avoid analyzing every bit of information found. Save the analysis for the needed situations. Keep the wording simple and use the terms primary information and secondary information. Generally, secondary information carries less weight than primary information in the analysis. Keep in mind that information, whether primary or secondary, may or may not be true. Now we're going to cover ideas that will help applicants understand the types of questions that should be addressed in regards to the reliability of information and the informant in a Level 1 4th-generation report. Again, not every question needs to be answered, so use your best judgment during the analysis. So let's start with, what type of information is it? Is the information or the informant primary, secondary, or undetermined? How is this known? Be sure to include details of why information is primary, secondary, or undetermined. Who is the informant? An example of this is a man giving information to a draft board when registering for the draft. The man was reporting in person and personally gave his birth date and other information to the draft board. This information is usually deemed reliable as far as the informant had correct information. When was the information recorded? Was it recorded near the time of the event or years later? An example of this is that the age and calculated birth year in a census enumeration within a few years of birth is more reliable than the census information recorded when the subject was 80 years old. How reliable are the record creator and the informant? Did the informant witness the event or relationship? Or did the informant have second-hand knowledge of the event? What is the relevance of the information found in the source? For example, birth information on a death certificate is not as relevant as the death information. Another example is the listing of a subject's parents on a death certificate is not as reliable as finding the parents listed on that person's birth record. What is the relationship between the informant and the subject? And what bearing does this have on the reliability of the information given? If an informant on the death certificate is distantly related to the subject versus a close relative, this would have a strong bearing on the reliability of the information. What information or record is missing that, if available, would strengthen the hypothesis? Many times there are clues within the record that hint at the creation of another record. For example, the probate record may mention the previous transfer of land in a deed from one family member to another. What is the rationale for accepting one piece of information over another? Again, this is the whole reason that all previous questions were addressed. Within the analysis, state why one piece of information was accepted over another. Here is a continuation of the reliability of the Stafford County Birth Register, now in regards to the reliability of the information and the informant. Notice the proper term primary information is used. Then, a possible explanation or conflict resolution is summarized. Then the conclusion about the reliability of the informant and the information found in the birth register is summarized. Notice a clear concluding statement ends the example. Also, remember to use the link in the description of the video to view the full example. Next, spend sufficient time correlating and comparing sources and their information and comparing evidence to develop a strong hypothesis. Thomas W. Jones states that, quote, evidence is a tentative answer to a genealogical question. When we test an answer with analysis and correlation, it becomes a hypothesis. If the hypothesis passes the test, it becomes a conclusion. The level 1 requirement in regards to evidence is all generational links are proven with supporting evidence. Additionally, evidence presented is properly analyzed and correctly interpreted. And the report makes appropriate connections, shows coherent thinking, recognizes and provides analysis of assumptions and inferences, and provides compelling conclusions or syntheses. Evidence is the relevance of information to answer a question. Evidence can be direct, indirect, or negative. Direct evidence is supported with a direct statement that answers a question. So, for example, a man and a woman listed as parties in a marriage record. The marriage record makes a direct statement that the couple was married. Direct evidence always needs at least one other independent source to confirm and verify it. But if at least one of these sources is original, containing primary information that leads to direct evidence, and this source is determined to be very reliable, then the analysis can be simple and straightforward. If the sources are less reliable, gather more evidence is needed. So indirect evidence is two or more pieces of information that don't directly state the answer to the question, but when they are combined, give ideas and information that lead to an answer. So an example of this would be when a man and a woman are listed together in the 1850 through the 1870 censuses, where a relationship is not explicitly stated. It can be only implied that this man and woman are married. It's not directly stated. They could be an unmarried brother and sister raising nieces and nephews with the same last name. So indirect evidence needs to be layered and correlated with other evidence in order to be proven true. So indirect evidence will need more analysis and correlation to form a strong conclusion. So in this example, finding a marriage record, a probate record, deeds, or birth records for the children to prove that this couple is married is needed in order to come to a strong conclusion. Negative evidence is when missing information or evidence leads to an answer to a question. An example of this would be a husband missing from the census adds a layer of evidence that he may be deceased. Negative evidence needs to be layered with other evidence in order to be proven true. Remember, a statement of direct, indirect, or negative evidence may or may not be true. Analysis and correlation with other evidence is always needed to one extent or another, with solid evidence needing less analysis and correlation. When it comes to evidence, answer the same questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. What type of evidence is it? Is this direct, indirect, or negative evidence? And how is this evidence relevant to the research question? What does the evidence indicate about the who, what, where, and when of the research question? And how does the evidence correlate with other evidence? Why is this evidence important? And what are the conflicting pieces of evidence that need to be resolved? This example is an outline of indirect evidence that was used to prove the marriage of Samuel Combest and Sarah Dick. In the overview, the researcher states the marriage information as found in the book entitled Descendants of Samuel Combest. This is an authored source, so more evidence is needed to prove this marriage. So first, the researcher looked in Chester County, South Carolina for marriages with nil results. Then in Pulaski County, Kentucky marriages, also with nil results. Then the researcher found the will of Samuel Combest, which states he wanted his estate sold for ample support for his wife Sally. Then the War of 1812 pension files were searched with nil results. And then the Pulaski County, Kentucky land deeds were searched, and a deed was found for Samuel Combest on the 23rd of August, 1821, in which his wife Sarah releases her dower. Next, Pulaski County probate records were searched for the probate of John Dick, Sarah's probable father, and he likely died in Kentucky, and there were nil results here. So then tax records were searched for John Dick and Samuel Combest, and these records showed that both owned land on Fishing Creek in Pulaski County, Kentucky. Then naming patterns were covered. The naming pattern of naming a child using the wife's maiden name. So Samuel and Sarah named a son Samuel D. Combest, who named his son Samuel Dick Combest. Then naming patterns from the 1800s were covered, and this is where children are named after the parents of the couple. So Samuel and Sarah named their first son John, likely after John Dick, Sarah's probable father. And then their third daughter was named Margaret, and she was likely named after Sarah's probable mother, Margaret Peggy Wiley. These sources of indirect evidence indicate that it's likely that Sarah Dick was the wife of Samuel Combest. Please review the full example of this proof by using the link in the description of this video. So back to our evidence analysis process map. When sources, information, and evidence are all analyzed together, the researcher can show strong proof of the life events and relationships for their research subjects. Next, test the hypothesis and develop a solid conclusion. A level 1 requirement in regard to making solid conclusions is solid conclusions were made that were fully supported by the evidence presented in the report. And no unjustified conclusions or hasty generalizations were made. The evaluation was not tailored to fit a preconceived notion. Let's go over a few definitions to clarify ideas that will help in developing a conclusion. A hypothesis is a possible answer to a genealogical question based on available beginning evidence, but the idea is not yet proven. Next, a theory is a well-reasoned answer to a genealogical question based upon all available evidence. A well-tested theory becomes a solid conclusion. A conclusion is the answer to a genealogical question that has been well-researched, correlated, analyzed, and tested using all available evidence. And a proof is a documented and well-reasoned conclusion to a genealogical question, which is arrived at by using all available evidence. This includes solid analysis and correlation of the sources, information, and evidence. Additionally, a solid proof includes thorough research, accurate source citations, and resolution of all conflicts. A written proof is a section of a report that answers a genealogical question, which is arrived at by analyzing and correlating all the available evidence. Written proofs are often referred to as proof arguments, which are detailed and extensive and often cover several paragraphs or pages to thoroughly convey a conclusion. Proof summaries, also written, are generally more simple, involving 1 or 2 paragraphs to present the evidence and conclusions. A proof statement is just that, a simple written statement that's comprised of a few sentences that convey the conclusion. The following ideas are used with the permission of Thomas W. Jones and can be found in his book entitled Mastering Genealogical Proof. The first technique is to use a single hypothesis. This is where the researcher focuses on one hypothesis while discussing substantiating evidence and then states the conclusion. This technique works well when the researcher has found solid, direct evidence that is simple and straightforward. Present alternative hypotheses when 2 theories come to light. When there's an alternative hypothesis, present the 2 competing hypotheses and discuss evidence for each. Then state the rationale for accepting one conclusion over the other. Building blocks work well when layering evidence. So start with the known facts and add and build evidence as you work toward the conclusion. Present items one by one with little or no repetition, backtracking, or cross-referencing. If points are independent, begin with the major points and end with minor points. With syllogisms, use if-then statements to support the conclusions being made. Present evidence in a logical order to lead from one syllogism to another to show strong conclusions. Now that we've covered presenting analysis and correlation in a Level 1 report, remember to resolve all conflicting evidence. Watch the video, Model for a Well-Written Proof, for ideas on conflict resolution. Here's the Level 1 requirement in regards to conflict resolution. All conflicting evidence presented in the report is fully addressed, and where possible, conflicts are resolved appropriately. Remember that genealogical conclusions are not considered reliable if conflicts are not resolved. If this is the case, state the need for further research. And lastly, remember to present a strong concluding statement to recap the well-developed conclusion. Now let's cover an example of our model for a well-written proof. In this example, techniques for developing a theory or hypothesis and then making a strong conclusion are demonstrated. So our example begins with a title or an objective. Maiden name of Elizabeth, first wife of Charles Gill. Then we have our overview. Several documents in the Stafford County Chancery case file entitled Jenny Jones, etc. versus widow of Charles E. Gill show that Elizabeth Gill's maiden name was likely Holmes. This is our single hypothesis. Next, we have a building block. The first key document in the case file, which confirms the marriage of Charles and Elizabeth, is a letter from the plaintiff, Jenny Gill Jones, and her attorney. It states that the maiden name of Charles' first wife was Holmes, although a first name was not given. The next clue from the file is an extract from the will of James Holmes, where he bequeaths land to his 2 eldest daughters, Elizabeth Virginia and Angelina Margaret. This is our next building block. Next, we have our transition. Considering this information, we can conclude. And then we have our syllogism. If James Holmes is the father of Elizabeth Virginia and Angelina Margaret, then Elizabeth's full maiden name is Elizabeth Virginia Holmes. Then we have another building block. We can further conclude that this court case centers on the land owned by Charles E. Gill's first wife, bequeathed to her by her father James Holmes, and held in courtesy by Charles for his natural life. Then we have another building block. Additionally, a deed exists stating that Charles Gill bought land from Angelina Holmes, land bequeathed to Angelina by her father, James Holmes. We have no conflicts to resolve in this proof. So then we make our strong concluding statement. All of these documents are directly connected to the land originally owned by James Holmes, although the documents don't directly state the full name of Charles Edward Gill's first wife of Elizabeth. These layers of indirect evidence show that her full maiden name was most certainly Elizabeth Virginia Holmes. Here's some writing tips to help write a solid research report or a successful Level 1 report. First, use good judgment and creativity to present evidence in a logical manner. Title each proof or section and subsection. Use topic sentences and concluding sentences in each proof. Avoid grouping evidence into source categories. Instead, group evidence according to the proof being developed. Often sources are used more than once throughout the report. Write well-constructed sentences that are simple, concise, and direct, using transitions to help the report flow from idea to idea. Choose words that accurately and simply convey ideas. Avoid adding unnecessary details, ideas, and words. Proofread for topographical and grammatical errors. Use present tense verbs to refer to sources currently in existence and for living people. Use past tense verbs to refer to sources that no longer exist, deceased people, and past events. Avoid passive voice when possible. For example, instead of stating, in 1850, Sam had been residing in Texas, state, in 1850, Sam was residing in Texas, or even, in 1850, Sam resided in Texas. Avoid using confusing pronouns by restating the names of subjects as needed. Also, remind the reader of relationships between subjects as needed to help them understand the analysis better. Avoid using confusing or repetitive possessives. For example, instead of stating George's brother's land, state the land of James, the brother of George. Avoid speculating about possibilities that don't have adequate proof. Place detailed citation information about the location of sources in the footnote citation instead of in the narrative. In the analysis and correlation of evidence, state enough information from each source that the reader can follow the analysis. Lack of information found in the source makes it difficult for the reader to follow the analysis. When writing proofs, avoid making points or covering topics that don't directly prove the conclusion of the proof. Here is the list of resources used to create this video. These references would also be helpful for further study of analysis and correlation to improve writing skills. Thank you to the following accredited genealogist professionals who contributed examples for this video. If you have any questions, here is my contact information. Thank you for watching this video. Keep working hard and expanding your knowledge as you work toward accreditation.